voters across the country have made 2020 the year they got out and voted. A divisive election season boils down to these next few weeks as ballots get counted and certified. Tonight, we'll share the latest results from across Washington and Idaho. We'll also break down how we got here and what the early numbers mean for Washington and Idaho residents. Joining NWPB's Vote 2020 Election Night Special, Austin Jenkins from the Northwest News Network, political and communication scientists from Washington State University, Scott Leadingham, NWPB News Manager, members of the League of Women Voters from Benton and Franklin counties, Andrew Bartline and Vaughn A. Fair, students from the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University, and Allison Harris from the Civic Scoop, Pullman. Live across all NWPB services, this is the NWPB Vote 2020 Election Night Special. And now, the host of our show, Murrow College professor Matt Lovelace.
Welcome to Northwest Public Broadcasting's Vote 2020 Election Night Special. I am Matt Lovelace. Over the next hour, we're going to take a look at some early returns for area and statewide races around Washington and Idaho. And thank you to those watching on TV, online, and listening to us through all of NWPB's broadcast services. You heard there in that opening, we have a big guest list tonight. A number of topics we'll address with those guests. Each segment has been tailored to our guests' area of research or expertise. And of course, we will update you on some early returns for races, ballot measures, but tonight, all about context. Now, we won't be calling any races tonight, save for updates on any concessions or official announcements that may happen throughout the program, and we do have a number of those in Washington already. We will have numbers running along the bottom of your screen all night. You can also find the most up-to-date results at the Washington Secretary of State's website. And we are also watching the presidential race, have been all night, and with any major developments on that, we'll quickly get you over to PBS NewsHour coverage, which you're looking at live now. And we're excited to add that context with some wonderful panelists. Michael Ritter will stick with us throughout. He's an assistant professor from WSU's School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs. Thank you, Michael. A research focus on political methodology. Mr. Ritter studies political behavior, public policy, campaigns, as well as state and local politics. Our other panelist will join us after he finishes his work at the Washington State University Voter Hub. It's Ben Calabretta. He's the Associate Director at WSU's Center for Civic Engagement. His focus includes engaging with young voters. The CCE has spent years connecting students with civic engagement opportunities, including their projects such as Cougs Vote. And Mr. Ritter, as you saw, is here now. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's first talk about the run-up to this election first. And before we get to your analysis, I want to give some context to our viewers with some of the early voting numbers. And while we didn't see the results of the early returns on submitted ballots, we did know a lot of people participated early in this election. In fact, if we just take a look at the data in Washington State, as of last night, the day before the election, more than 3.5 million ballots had been counted in Washington. That was already a record number of voters for any election in the state's history. This amounts to a turnout of 72.7%. Now, that's up past 77% as of just a couple of hours ago. Comparing that to 2016's numbers the day before the election, 52% of votes had come in, just more than 2.2 million. So, Mr. Ritter, let's start our discussion there. An election that, at least in their sealed ballots at the time, was largely decided before we woke up here on Election Day. Obviously, mail-in voting, something Washingtonians more comfortable with than what some discussions nationally would have suggested. What have you seen in watching this election cycle that has activated so much early voting?
Well, I think it's an election that has sparked a lot of enthusiasm, as is attested by a number of polls that have been taken on the subject. It's a very enthusiasm-provoking election. I think also the great coverage or the extensive coverage on this election has exposed individuals to ways of voting beyond in-person election day voting. The most common alternative way of voting that we've become increasingly familiar with over the past few months has been mail or absentee voting. And as you were noting earlier, indeed, turnout levels through absentee or mail voting have indeed been very high. In fact, according to the United States Elections Project at the University of Florida, there have been approximately 101 million votes cast before Election Day, either in-person early voting, of which there were 36 million in-person early voters and 65 million votes via absentee or mail voting. And as you noted previously, the mail voting has been very high in Washington, and the same is true of our neighbor down in Oregon. And in fact, the turnout levels in Washington and Oregon before Election Day actually exceeded the turnout levels in the 2016 presidential election. And if you look nationwide, as I said earlier, 100 million people have already voted in person, early, or via mail or absentee before Election Day. 137 million people voted in the 2016 election, both in-person Election Day and before Election Day. That means that before Election Day, basically 75% of the 2016 turnout had already come out to vote for 2020. And so I think the things that sparked that interest was basically the polarizing nature of this year's race, as well as basically the increased awareness of mail voting and alternative ways of voting beyond in-person Election Day.
And you mentioned the incredible amount of turnout coming into the day before a number of these ballots were received. The U.S. Postal Service had even said they had processed 100 million ballots, and I think that was back on October 22nd. Now, if you recall, October 22nd was also the night of the final presidential debate. That means at least 100 million people had sort of seen all they needed to see in this election, which sort of brings me to my question of undecided voters. With such a high turnout, are we likely also seeing a fairly low level of undecideds in this election?
I don't know about that. Research on early voting and mail voting and absentee voting are also forms of early voting, meaning you're voting before Election Day. Research tends to show that individuals that have already made up their mind or are fairly certain of their vote choice tend to vote earlier. Individuals who haven't made up their mind tend to wait until longer into the early voting period, if not Election Day itself, to cast ballots. And so by the time we reach the presidential debates, actually most people who will be early voters, not all of them, but most of them have likely made up their mind and they cast their ballots accordingly. And polling results have shown that early voters, whether absentee, mail, or in-person early voting, have tended to tilt towards supporting Biden, whereas individuals who have said that they're going to vote in-person Election Day, meaning today, tend to lean towards President Trump in terms of their preferences. And so it may lead to some interesting voting results over the next few hours or next few days if the election results stretch into the next few days. Whereas what I mean by that is whereas the early voting and absentee results may suggest that Biden's doing better, as the in-person Election Day votes trickle in, we may see more parity between the election results between the Biden and Trump contest. Or sides.
Certainly, we're hearing a lot of warnings of don't settle in tonight. Be patient with the results coming in. Now, did I hear we do have Ben Calabretta available on the call as well? Ben, thank you so much for hopping on. I know you've had a busy day so far today working at the Voter Hub at Washington State. Just really quickly, and we'll return to you for some perspective on young voters. I'm just curious, on the ground, so to speak, any observations from your work with the CCE today in terms of voter engagement?
Today was pretty inspiring. We had almost 500 students, well, not just students, but students and other community members come to the student voting hub at the Cub today. And, a lot of them, this was their first time voting. They really didn't have any idea how to do it or weren't sure of how it all worked. But yeah, it was a really steady stream of several busy times throughout the day. And, yeah, it was just inspiring to see so many people there, especially with a mail-in state like Washington, just to have that many people coming in and with like COVID happening at the same time. I'm kind of anxious to see how it goes next time. Hopefully there's not COVID, the next general election. But anyway, it was good to see so many people out and learning about voting and how to do it.
I don't think it's editorializing to say I think we all hope that for the next presidential election. Well, thank you both. We'll go back to you both for more insight throughout the show tonight. And a reminder to our viewers and listeners, you can find results from tonight's races at NWPB.org. We've got you covered on Eastern Washington, county level races, legislative contests, statewide races. More Washington numbers can be found at the Secretary of State's website. Now, we've also got our eye on Idaho. We'll start with a couple of races there. And I want to take a look at some of tonight's early numbers. Idaho hasn't reported reported many of their numbers, but we do have a big Senate race to focus across the state tonight. Incumbent Jim Risch and three challengers, including Democrat Paulette Jordan, who many will remember campaigned for Idaho's governor in 2018. Jim Risch leading that race right now with 53% of the vote. Again, these numbers are not final. And a District 1 congressional race in Idaho. Russ Fulcher seeking a second two-year term in the U.S. House. Mr. Fulcher, the incumbent, leading big in this one so far, 63% of the vote over Rudy Soto, who's got 34%. And now to somebody who's been writing and discussing some of these headlines on a daily basis, Northwest Public Broadcasting News Manager Scott Leadingham. Scott, I know you're busy, your own election night coverage tonight, so thank you for taking some time with me.
Yeah, happy to do it. Thanks for having me.
Well, we just saw results for a couple of races, and let's step back, start a little bit broader, issues playing out in Idaho this election season. So we're on the border of a couple of states with, I think it's fair to say, different responses to COVID-19. How is the pandemic response playing out in these Idaho races?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the pandemic plays out in all races in all ways, but of course Idaho is much different than Washington and Oregon, its neighbors, and in particular things like the U.S. House and state legislative races are seeing a lot of people talking on both sides about mask mandates and the need for one statewide in Idaho. Of course there isn't one. It's one of the few states that doesn't have one. Some localities do, and Governor Brad Little has been reluctant to do too much statewide. That's sort of his brand of republicanism, and so those sorts of things are really playing out in these races. Just note that Governor Brad Little, although did recently make Idaho step back in its reopening to a phase 3, it was at a phase 4 statewide, so that kind of tells you some of the tensions and the issues that are coming up in Idaho.
Now, we had a race in Latah County. No results in for that just yet, but incumbent Tom Lamar looking to hold his commissioner's seat against Gabriel Wrench. Mr. Wrench, a candidate who was arrested during a mask protest. So continuing sort of that theme of COVID-19, mask wearing being such a turning point for a number of voters this election. What do you think was the fallout of that on the local level?
Well, yeah, Latah County is a very interesting blue-ish, purple-ish county in Idaho, one of the few, and that's largely because of the city of Moscow and the University of Idaho being there. But that being said, it's of course not a solid Democratic area. There's this definitely purplish nature to it, and you're seeing that in that race right there for county commissioner. You're also going to see it in the District 5 legislative races for state house and senate in that area too. Pandemic definitely plays in very large there. The city of Moscow, which is in Latah County, has a mask mandate. That's been pretty controversial in some areas of the city, particularly in some of the religious sectors that have objected to it in terms of personal freedom and its limitations on gatherings and religious ceremonies and the number of people allowed. So that's where you saw that arrest happen during one of those protests against the city of Moscow's measures, and it just so happens that one of the people was a candidate for office.
And we looked at a couple of the state legislative races there before we got to you. What might the outcome of these races look like for the January legislative session? I know a term you use, you talk about blue states and red states, shades of red in Idaho. So what might that mean as far as moving forward, and even including the election in a couple of years for a new governor?
Well, you're right. It's not often about how many Democrats are going to be in the state legislature in terms of bumping up against the Republican majority and tightening it. It's really how big the Republican supermajority is going to be in the state legislature. Just by way of example, as it stands right now tonight, there are 35 state Senate seats. Only 7 of them are held by Democrats in Idaho, and the margins are similar in the state House. So in terms of what we're looking at going into the next legislative session will be sort of what brand of Republican is going to be on top of controlling the state Senate and the state House going forward into 2021 as the pandemic continues and other budgetary issues are under consideration. And in terms of the governor's race, then we're going to be looking forward to what the margins are for 2022.
All right, Scott. Well, thank you for your perspective. We want to send people now to our regular programming on the radio side, joining NPR's coverage of Election 2020. To those listening, you can follow this program on Facebook or our website. And for those of you watching on TV and online, thank you for being here. I'm Matt Lovelace with Northwest Public Broadcasting's Vote 2020 Election Night Special. We move tonight to some major statewide races in Washington, including that for governor. We mentioned this earlier, and we have some numbers. Incumbent Jay Inslee seeking a third term. Republic Police Chief Lauren Culp emerged as the Republican candidate from a list of 35 challengers in that primary. Jay Inslee, the incumbent, with 60% of the vote. He is declaring victory in that race. Meantime, in the lieutenant governor's race, two Democrats, just the second statewide race we've seen featuring two candidates from the same major party in the state. Denny Heck, the incumbent, more moderate of the two, and challenger Marco Lias. Right now we're seeing Mr. Heck, longtime politician there. He is leading that race. Attorney General Bob Ferguson trying to hold on to his spot against Republican challenger Matt Larkin. In the Attorney General's race, Mr. Ferguson, the incumbent, again leading there as well. Strong day for the incumbents here in the state of Washington. And speaking of incumbents, a much tighter race for the Secretary of State, Kim Wyman, trying to manage a busy night in her office, certainly while seeking another term. This office occupied by a Republican since the 1960s. Democrat Gail Tarleton trying to change that tonight. Like I said, 52-48, a much closer race in that one tonight. And finally, a look at the race for Superintendent of Public Instruction. Certainly our schools, a major topic of discussion amid COVID-19. Chris Reichdahl, 57% of the vote, a substantial lead with about 3/4 of the vote in Washington state. And we'd like to welcome in now Austin Jenkins. He's an Olympia-based reporter for the Northwest News Network. Booked solid tonight as he's followed these statewide elections this election season. So we thank you very much for taking some time with us tonight, Austin.
Absolutely, and happy to be here.
Well, let's start with the governor's race. An incumbent seeking a third term, declaring his third term now against somebody without a background in politics. And like so many races, perhaps especially so here at the governor position, where coronavirus response squarely at the heart of this debate. So the big question here, has Inslee's or did Inslee's handling of COVID-19 affect any of his numbers here tonight?
Yeah, I actually would have thought that he might have softer support because of that. I mean, people have been told to stay home. Businesses have been affected. Scores of people have lost their jobs. But in fact, it looks like he may have picked up a county this year compared to 2016, and that would be Clark County in Southwest Washington. I mean, this is a significant win for him, 60%. But as you note, he was up against somebody who'd never run for office before, much less statewide office, was not well known, didn't have the funding. And Lauren Culp really took the opposite position and approach. Everything Inslee was doing on COVID, Culp was sort of the anti-to. So in that sense, voters had a real contrast. And Culp certainly had a very fired up base of support, but to translate that into something that even approaches what other Republican candidates for governor have been able to do in the past, he just wasn't able to get there.
Yeah, very interesting with that race. And a couple of other statewide offices in which Republicans are trying to hold on to. I want to talk about that Secretary of State's office race, since it is one of the closer ones tonight. A Republican position since the 1960s. Kim Wyman in it since 2013. I don't know how much we can draw from a 52-48 margin at this point in the night. What are you seeing in that race?
Yeah, this is a race that we were watching closely because had there been a blue wave or a blue tsunami, certainly Kim Wyman could have been swept up and swept out in that. It doesn't appear that that's the case. 4-point advantage is probably, she's probably feeling pretty good about that tonight. Certainly we got to watch the late arriving ballots, although there's been some talk that they may in fact favor Republican candidates because many Democrats were very motivated to vote early this year. So it looks like she'll hold on, and but this was definitely a high stakes campaign, and one where it was very much about what was the mood of the voters going to be, and would they still be willing to ticket split, which, as you know, they've been doing for a long time because we've had Democratic governors for going on 40 years and Republican secretaries of state for going on 60 years.
One of the races we didn't show in the display was the treasurer's race. Dwayne Davidson and Mike Pelliciotti. Looks like Pelliciotti coming out with an early lead in that race. I'll tell you, I haven't seen if there's been any concessions or announcements as far as that's concerned. What do we see on the treasurer position?
Yeah, that's not a real surprise. So there are two statewide Republican office holders. Kim Wyman, who is running for a third term here and appears poised to earn that third term. And then Dwayne Davidson, who became the state treasurer because two Republicans emerged from the primary in 2016. So there were two Republicans on the ballot. He's a first term treasurer trying to become a second term in a Democratic state, not well known, and we knew he was vulnerable after the primary when Mike Pelliciotti, who's a state legislator, outperformed him. So this is not a real surprise, and it certainly looks like Democrats are going to reclaim the state treasurer's office.
Very interesting. Well, Austin Jenkins, thank you so much for your perspective tonight, political reporter with Northwest News Network. We look forward to your coverage for the rest of this election cycle, which is certain not to end tonight.
Right. Thanks for having me.
All right, thank you. Well, there are a handful of advisory notes on the Washington ballot. Just one statewide referendum, and it's had a lot of people and especially parents talking this election season, and that's Referendum 90, the comprehensive sexual health education bill. And looking at some numbers in it so far, it has 60% approval. In fact, the people behind Approve Referendum 90 are declaring victory in this one so far, a pretty wide margin, as once again, about 3/4 of registered voters have weighed in on this. Now, Referendum 90 has been more colloquially referred to as the kindergarten sex ed bill. And in the lead up to the election, a lot of discussion here about exactly what age-appropriate sex ed was for any age group, but specifically for that 6 to 7-year-old age group. And with some more on what has gone into Referendum 90, I'd like to bring in Andrew Bartline. Andrew is a senior journalism and media production student at Washington State University, among the many at WSU's Murrow College who's been watching this election cycle very closely. Andrew, you looked into some of the efforts to get this bill on the ballot, as well as some of the pushback, of course, from those who opposed it. What did you find out?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. The Approve 90 campaign really says that this bill's data-driven. The argument is that comprehensive sex education is safer for kids rather than typical abstinence curriculum or what we have currently in the state. Those who oppose it, though, they say the finer details are concerning. They tried to work across the aisle. There were several amendments proposed for this bill. There was just no meeting in the middle. So those who oppose this bill, they just don't trust the specific language of this bill to mandate comprehensive sex ed in our public schools.
All right, and I think we have a piece from you. You talked to a couple of people who oppose that, including some stories from some folks tonight. Let's take a look.
A father changed Evan Kuhn's life.
Bye. Okay, bye-bye.
Everything now is for his son.
He's grown up. He's 2, so he's at that age where he's talking and all that.
A first-time voter, the father of a 2-year-old has some thinking to do. Now, we'd all expect to see a sexual education curriculum here at a high school, but what about a middle school? What about an elementary school? A state Senate bill proposed that all public school students in the state have some form of a sex ed curriculum young as kindergarten, and your ballot gets a vote on it this general election.
Seems like they're kind of pushing it. They may be giving out a little more information than they should.
The Approve 90 campaign says curriculum is age appropriate, K through 3, subject to social and emotional learning. Parents can review the materials and opt out.
If that's what they really wanted this to be about, they would have mandated Aaron's Law, but they didn't.
Where comprehensive sex ed is taught, kids prolong having sex. So it's safer.
Some schools across the state say it takes power away from local districts. META North Spokane says the unfunded mandate puts them further behind the books.
We're not against sex ed, but we're against comprehensive sex ed being forced into our schools.
Instead of fighting against this really important area of education for our students, let's work on making better curriculum.
This November, Evan can only vote what he thinks is best for his son.
Well, great report there, Andrew. Thank you so much. Now, as a parent of a child who will be in kindergarten next year, certainly been on our radar in our house. So my question, maybe just a little bit of clarity. What is kindergarten sex ed curriculum?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. It took me a little bit to figure it out myself. The term they use is social emotional learning. It's a bit of a word salad. Really what it means, it's K through 3 curriculum, and it's about personal boundaries, human development, identifying trusted adults, healthy decision making, managing emotion, things along those lines.
Some of the efforts to maybe better define that and make it a little clearer for parents like me were shot down. What were some of the qualifiers that initial opponents of the idea had tried to put in there?
Yeah, that's another great question, actually. So social emotional learning by definition sounds very appropriate by reasonable standards. Those opposing the bill, though, they're concerned because they offered over 200 amendments to more define what this curriculum allows, what's okay, what's not okay. 40 to 50 of them were discussed, and they were shot down. The only one that was approved was the opt-out option. Just 3 in front of me that I can reference quickly. They wanted to ban sex ed curriculum, materials, and instruction and other coursework. With this bill, there is nothing banning English class from having this material leak over into it. So you can opt your kid out of the structured curriculum, but you can't opt them out of English class, and nothing stops that. Moreover, grade level learning objectives posted on school websites and made public. Right now, if you want to know the objective of your kindergartner or third grader in this curriculum, they don't legally have to supply the learning objectives to you. And I guess lastly, a good one for older students, how to recognize online predators, danger signs, sex trafficking. It's almost like virtual Aaron's Law, I guess is a good euphemism for it. Resources to report these. That was also denied as well. So you can see people on either side arguing for, moral reasons or over content. But really sort of people in the middle who maybe lean right a little bit, they didn't like this bill because there was an unwillingness to narrowly tailor it and compromise. So it sort of made a health and safety issue with children in our state become partisan.
All right, well, thank you very much, Andrew, for that report. Great work there. And I'm guessing, like a number of things in this election, this is probably not the last we will discuss Referendum 90 before it's enacted. We appreciate your perspective there. Well, let's bring Michael Ritter and Ben Calabretta back into the discussion here. We just heard a number of efforts to better define sex education for particular age groups. Advocates seemed opposed to a number of qualifiers. We'll start with you, Mr. Ritter. Do we get a sense as to why that is?
I don't think we get a clear idea, but from the polling numbers, I should say the early voting results, it seems that most Washingtonians seem to agree that some sort of health measure along this of this nature is needed for the state's educational system. And I will also point out that the power to vote on a referendum is a critical tool that a number of states offer to their citizens to have a policy impact on how various responsibilities such as the educational system are handled. And I think that with the voting on the referendum such as we have now, it's sending a clear signal to the state government that a sizable number of Washingtonians think that this may be a wise decision in which to take the educational system regarding health care, or I should say regarding health policy.
Yeah, very interesting. And Mr. Calabretta, I'll just ask you, because I set this up, just being a parent, not that I'm for or against, I just wanted a little more clarity. I wasn't sure how you saw this bill. Do you think it's a fair assessment to say we probably should know a little bit more what's in curriculum for kindergartners?
I think it's hard to get specific with curriculum when you have so many school districts participating, but the fact that parents can opt out, I think, is key there. So I do know that WCU students specifically, the Cougar lobby team, were lobbied for this. For the most part, the students want this referendum to pass and support it. But obviously, I'm not speaking for all students. It's just a general feel.
Yeah, very interesting. All right, thank you very much, gentlemen. And thank you to Andrew Bartline again for great reporting from the Murrow College of Communication. We'll get more student work and analysis later in the show. Meantime, our Vote 2020 coverage, if you've been following us since the summer, has spent a lot of time in Benton and Franklin counties, including several contested races for their respective county commissions. In fact, 2/3 of those county commissions were up for election. So let's take a look at some early returns from those. First, a couple of positions on the Benton County Commission. For District 1, Jerome Delvin and Justin Rafa against each other. Mr. Delvin, a commanding lead so far in that one. In District 3, we had William McKay and James Beaver. We talked to both of these gentlemen when it came to the debate season. Mr. McKay coming in with some good early numbers in this one, 59% of the vote. And moving over to Franklin County, the District 1 Commissioner seat has Brad Peck leading 44% of the vote with about 22,000 of those votes in the District 2 seat for Franklin County Commissioner, Rocky Mullen and Ana Ruiz Peralta. Mr. Mullen with a commanding lead so far in that one. And finally, the race for Superior Court Judge, Position 1, a race that is nonpartisan. Dave Peterson with an early lead in that one. Mr. Peterson and Sharon Brown emerged from among 6 candidates in that primary. And joining me now is Beverly Johnson Torelli, president of the League of Women Voters in Benton and Franklin County. Now, you were an integral part of our partnership with the League in getting a number of these virtual forums and debates on the air during the cycle. So thank you so much for being here tonight.
I can't hear you, Matt.
Thank you very much for all of the work you did here tonight. I think she's having a little bit of trouble hearing from us. We'll try to reach out to Bev as, once again, she has spent a lot of time working with us. And I want to talk a bit about those outreach efforts. In fact, you've likely heard of the League of Women Voters mentioned in a number of debates across the state, not just our own. Engagement with the community, despite the pandemic, has been a major effort for the League on the local and statewide level. Obviously, COVID-19 changed just about everything in our lives, and certainly during a general election year, one of those was a concern for how we get candidates in front of voters. I'm not sure, Bev, can you hear me out there?
I can hear you off and on.
Okay, well, we'll try to get some questions out. Once again, everybody, we're connecting through Skype, and you know, this is sort of the topic of the election season, is how do we get people in front of voters? How do we get these outreach efforts out there? I'm curious for your perspective, Bev, what was it like sort of organizing debates and forums and working with those outreach efforts across the state this year?
Well, actually, we were able to pivot early on to our virtual candidate forums with you guys, and we appreciate it so much with our candidate forums and debates that we were able to do all of those, both the primaries and the general elections, on Northwest Public Broadcasting. I think that our candidates really appreciated it too. But other things that we ended up doing so to try to get out the vote and encourage voting was we ran a high school essay contest for Pasco, Kennewick, and Richland high school students with the theme of "Your Vote is Our Future." And we were able to have donors donate enough money to give $1,200 awards to the first place winners and $500 awards to the second place winners. With that, we had wonderful contestants, and it really gave us a great deal of faith in the newer generation. They did a fabulous job, and it was very challenging to actually pick the winners. In the meantime, we also pivoted to our civics education class and that we give in the high school classes. We pivoted to a virtual platform for that. The biggest obstacle, I guess you could say, was voter registration, because we weren't able to physically go to places like back to school nights or naturalization ceremonies to really do voter registration. Our lifesaver, though, was our vote411.org, where voters can go to register online and look up candidate information and other voter services. So in the end, I think we were able to reach out to a few people. In the last little while here, restrictions loosened, and we were able to do voter registration at food banks with both members and community members. So that was great in the end. So it was challenging, but as soon as we pivoted, we came up with some great ideas. And like I said, especially you guys as partners. So that really helped.
I think we see a lot of industries, and certainly the election industry, so to speak, had to adapt, and certainly one of the ones that did. Now, we did 13 debates. We talked to 26 candidates over a 2-week period, and of course a number of those in Benton and Franklin County. In those commission races, that Superior Court position I just talked about, frankly, there was a lot at stake in terms of area political dynamics. Now, I'm aware League of Women Voters is nonpartisan, but I'm curious to get your perspective and a sense for how much was on the line tonight in that area.
Can you repeat that, Matt? I can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm curious about the political dynamics and sort of what was on the line in the Tri-Cities tonight.
Well, I don't know if you're talking about issues, or I can talk about the Benton, Franklin County and the Benton County Commissioner races and the Franklin County Commissioner races.
Yeah,
they're probably the most interesting that you'd like to hear. So in the Tri-Cities, as you know, we're really conservative, but we also had some Democrats that made the top 2 places this time in the voting, went through the primaries to the general election in the top 2 spots. So, for example, I don't know how it's going to turn out for sure. We just have preliminary results at the moment. But if Mr. Delvin and Mr. Beaver both win for the Benton County Commissioner, of course, the status quo will prevail. Another possibility is a win by either Mr. Rafa or Mr. McKay brings a younger generational viewpoint and possibly new energy to the commission. A Delvin McKay or a Rafa Beaver combination would mix experience with someone who is learning on the commission. Rafa is the lone Democrat in this race, on these races, so his election could change the dynamics more than any of the other combinations. In the Franklin County Commissioner races, if Mr. Peck wins, as noted by the Tri-City Herald, his experience will prevail. A win by Miss Ruiz Peralta and or Miss Lehrman would bring a female, younger generational and democratic perspective to the commission. Miss Ruiz Peralta also would represent the majority Latinx population in Pasco. On the other hand, if Mr. Mullen is successful, he may align more with the status quo, but perhaps offer a newer perspective. As always, the candidates' unique backgrounds in all of these races will have some bearing on how they relate to each other in the community. And as many people know, the 6 commissioners make up the board of the Benton Franklin Health District. So that could change the dynamics there as well. So it'll be interesting to see how it comes out and whether we have status quo or some mixture of different opinions on these boards.
Well, Beverly Johnson-Torelli, thank you so much, not just for joining us tonight, but for your work with our coverage since the summer and for the League's efforts this election season. Have a great night.
Thank you so much, Matt, for having us.
And a reminder, if you're looking for Benton and Franklin County races or any topics affecting Eastern Washington and North Central Idaho tonight, you can find results at NWPB.org. And of course, up-to-date information on any Washington race can be found at the Secretary of State's website. And speaking of Washington races, Eastern Washington's representation in the U.S. House of Representatives was on the line tonight. A pair of incumbents trying to hold on to their seats in District 5. Kathy McMorris Rogers seeking a 9th term representing the district against challenger Dave Wilson. Fairly commanding lead there for Kathy McMorris Rogers at 60% of the vote. In District 4, another Republican incumbent, Dan Newhouse, going for a 4th term in Congress. Democrat Doug McKinley emerged as the challenger from that primary. Mr. Newhouse, an even wider lead, holding on to his seat in that election. Now, McMorris Rogers, Newhouse, District 3's representative, 3 Republican representatives out of the state's 10 in Congress, all up for re-election for these 2-year seats. And I want to bring back Mr. Ritter and Mr. Calabretta to get a sense of how things shook out tonight. Certainly some early results deciding that the Democrats continued to hold the Senate. What have we seen out there in terms of the U.S. legislature?
Well, it looks like Rogers and Newhouse will win re-election. I guess it shows the importance of incumbency in predicting election results. Incumbency, if you've held a seat in office before, you tend to accrue name value advantages. You tend to be more likely to gain supporters. For instance, other party allies in Congress that are willing to campaign for you, interest groups that are willing to contribute more campaign financing means to your campaign war chest. Basically, I think these races show the importance of incumbency in shaping election results. And I think that's what we see with the new House and Rogers contests and their likely returns to Congress.
And the big question is what's kind of the big factor voters take into account when voting? And we talk about the pandemic. One of the side effects of the pandemic is business and business owners looking for economic support from their representatives. Mr. Calabretta, in sort of looking at this issue, did you see this being one of those issues that a lot of voters took into account here in Eastern Washington?
You know, I probably don't know enough about this. I would guess that these Republican incumbents are essentially institutions at this point in Eastern Washington, and I would guess that. I don't know enough about that.
And perhaps the better question
totally
is
speculating.
Perhaps the better question in terms of when you're working with your civic engagement is how do you reach the young voter in terms of understanding issues of not just a presidential race, not just a race between two gubernatorial candidates, but what these representatives mean, especially here in these two districts who sort of control half of the state.
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, we try to emphasize not just the presidential election or the governor's race, but also how more local elections, even congressional districts like this, can really impact their lives on a day-to-day basis. So that is something that's a big part of the voter education that is a part of Cougs Vote, like the Democratic engagement campaign that we do at WSU. So it's a lot of voter education. Public discussion around different issues, things like that. So, it's always that's a struggle. Regardless, is helping people understand that local elections are important to them as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Speaking of local elections, I want to turn our attention to Whitman County. We really just had one contested race on the county commission. Now, we will mention at this point in the night here at about 9:41 p.m., no results in from Whitman County. That county, one of just 4 in the state, not reporting any numbers just yet. But we do want to talk about this race between Dean Kinzer and independent Tom Handy. Mr. Kinzer, the Republican incumbent. And joining us to talk about this race, Allison Harris from the Civic Scoop Pullman. Allison joined us for the live debate between these two candidates a number of weeks ago. Thanks for connecting with us here on election night, Allison.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's good to be here.
Yeah, good to see you again. And we touched on this topic in the debate, city versus county in this race. Handy, and he clarified this, despite his physical address, he's painted as the city of Pullman candidate versus Kinzer, the county candidate. And we saw this in the form of financial support this election season, correct?
Correct. You know, it's been really interesting because as I've followed city politics for a while now, I noticed that over the last couple of years when the city and the county interacted, there always seemed to be a little friction between them. And so when I checked to see who donated to who, I noticed that Mr. Handy's donors were primarily people who were influential within our city of Pullman, like Mayor Johnson and some city council members, the president of the Chamber of Commerce in Pullman, whereas the people who donated to Dean Kinzer were the other county commissioners and another big developer in our county. And so it was just interesting that the donors for both candidates really kind of showed that there was a city versus county situation going on with the two candidates.
Did you get a sense as to why that was in this race?
Well, like I mentioned before, I guess I have some conjecture here, but I did seem to notice in the politics that there was a little bit of friction. So I'm wondering if the city people would love to have someone in the county government that they can trust to work well with them, because Mr. Handy has been involved with city boards, like being the president of the downtown association, and some other city boards that he's been on in the past, and he's worked well with a lot of those city people. So I think that's probably why.
Yeah, very interesting perspective. We will be interested to see when those numbers do come in. I'm sure we'll all be refreshing the Secretary of State's website all night. Allison Harris from the Civic Scoop Pullman, thank you so much for joining us. You can find her coverage on all sorts of community issues by finding the Civic Scoop on social media. Have a great night.
Thanks so much.
And voter turnout, as we've already talked about on this program, such a major topic coming into the election in Washington. We had historic primary numbers in August. A sharp uptick turns the focus to groups that have largely been underrepresented at polls, young people and people of color. Now, demographic data showed from 2014 to 2018's midterms among black voters rose from 40% to more than 51%, and we wondered if we could see a similar increase from general to general. WSU journalism student Vonne Fair explored this issue, talking to black students and first-time voters about how they approached this election. Vonne, I want to thank you for joining us here tonight.
Hi, Matt. Thank you so much. I did get the opportunity to go out and talk to some black voters, and they were able to share with me some frustrations and emotions with this election.
I'm just wanting equality and just a lot of things that we haven't gotten.
This is Washington State University junior Kayla Brody. For the first time in her life, she is eligible to vote. But for her, voting means more than just signing her name.
So I feel like my life being a woman and being black is greatly affected by politics. So I think it's kind of my duty to be aware of everything that's going on.
This election, a new generation is eligible to vote. Many first-time voters like Brody are hopeful that the voices of young black Americans will be heard and make a difference. According to the Pew Research Center, nearly half of all black eligible voters are millennials or Gen Z, and they're heading to the polls in record-breaking numbers. Brody says that although she has always been interested in politics, being a college student has influenced her vote.
Maybe I've gotten a little bit more mature and my knowledge has grown because it was a little bit more important since I can vote now.
This past week, Brody dropped her ballot off at a drop box just like this one. But while Brody considers herself politically involved, that isn't the case for all first-time voters. Washington State University senior Ayub Ishmael says that in the past, he didn't consider himself politically involved.
I didn't really become more aware until I came to college. I was politically apathetic. I didn't really care about politics before, but now it's definitely something I look at.
Ishmael says that this election has caused him to grow and learn. He wants to be more aware because he says this election impacts his life and others who look like him. From politically apathetic to enthused, young black voters share the same hope and message for others.
It is our civil right and duty to vote. We have this right for a reason. So use it.
It's important to vote. Go vote. Let your voice be heard.
In Pullman, I'm Vonne Fair.
And obviously lots changed in terms of discussions about race since 2016. And Vonne, I'm curious for your perspective, just a couple of quick thoughts. What role do you think things like the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor deaths and the fallout from those played in activating black voters this election season?
Yeah, I think that the events of this past summer had a huge impact on these voters. And I think with young black voters, for the first time in their lives, they felt motivated and obligated to participate in civic engagement. And that was directly because of the fact that these events were extremely personal to them. So I think that the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor sparked a passion. And since the protests of this past summer, we've only seen that passion grow. And now we see that passion with a lot of first-time voters.
And you're a college student, and one of the people in your story said coming to college sort of sparked that interest in political issues. And really, that always seems to be a discussion election season. What was different this year, even you as a young voter?
Mm-hmm. I think this year there's been a lot of events that have sparked conversations with college-age voters and millennials and Gen Zers, especially on social media. And I think that, voters my age are realizing for the very first time that events like coronavirus and civil rights movements have an impact and they have real political connections. And the conversations about these events only kind of shine the light on these connections. So I think more than ever, voters my age and myself, I'm more involved and I'm more engaged this election season.
Well, Vonne, thank you very much. Great work tonight. We appreciate your perspective on this.
Thank you.
And bringing back our panelists to talk about it, and really just a quick question. We have about a minute. And this one, I know, was your area of expertise, Mr. Calabretta, with your work for the Center for Civic Engagement. This is part of your effort here on the Washington State University campus. Do you feel like 2020 has been different for young voters?
Well, it's been different in a lot of ways with COVID, but I've felt the energy personally. And early estimates show that the youth vote specifically is up a percentage point or two from like out of Tufts University. So that's a good sign. And I will just say from the student voting hub today, the thoughtfulness that the students, the time they took and the effort they put in to really vote and know what they were voting about was evident. And again, like I started this discussion with, it was inspiring. So it was a good experience. And yes, that is one of our main goals, is to get them interested and show them how to do it right.
Yeah, it's certainly a topic of discussion, it seems like, every election season, but this one, it seems to have definitely worked. It'll be interesting to see the demographic data when all those breakdowns come down. Well, the two of you stick around. We're going to get some final thoughts of you about this election and what's ahead before we wrap up the show tonight. But I'd sort of like to begin the discussion there, here about 10 minutes before the end of our program, taking a bit of an opportunity to step back and reflect on this election season in general. It's close to 10 p.m. Pacific time. It's almost 1 a.m. at the White House. So with the exception of the next week or two as final ballots are counted, this election cycle is coming to an end, and unprecedented in many ways, surely in terms of misinformation, disinformation, to the way the national media has covered this, the behavior of candidates, COVID-19 being the topic that dominated discourse. And joining me for a discussion about all of these things and what's next, a couple of great researchers here on the Washington State University campus. Paul Bowles, who's the Associate Dean of Research at the Murrow College, as well as Jordan Foley, an assistant professor whose research includes the flow of political information through the digital space. Gentlemen, I know you've been watching tonight's counts closely and really this whole election season. Thank you both for being here tonight. Now, we've tabbed both of you as our social scientists here. And really what I want to dig into is the political discourse. How are we interacting with one another? What, with the news we read, with the way our expectations of candidate behavior are evolving? Mr. Foley, I sort of want to talk to you with that, because there's so many things that go into how we interact with news media during an election cycle.
Absolutely. People come into contact with political information in ways that we typically don't expect. I think people like myself, and perhaps people who are involved in journalism, tend to think of people as more engaged in politics than they really are. And I think it's really important for us not only to communicate, sort of to help inform people about how to react to uncertain situations like this in elections that have such a decentralized administrative process and are difficult to navigate even for people within their own state, let alone able to sort of make sense of everything that's happening in a bunch of different states as well. And so it's important, I think, for journalists in particular, when they're thinking about writing stories and sort of what the impact of those can be, that it's really important to center the voter as sort of the protagonist in the story. That oftentimes we see these really emotive, conflict-based, newsworthy stories about political elites sort of going at one another over an outcome like an election or a piece of legislation or something like that. And I think that ends up driving an emotional process that I think is really rooted in a form of partisanship that we really need to be attentive to. And that I think both as people are navigating their information environment, to be able to identify when those things are happening, in the articles that they're reading, or even being able to reflect on their own personal biases as they're navigating this information abundance is crucially important, especially at a time like this.
And you mentioned the word emotion. And at the risk of making this sound like a science discussion, we'll bring in Mr. Bowles. I want to introduce our audience to a word you taught me, neuropolitics. So this is an area of study for you. What is neuropolitics, and how have you applied this to 2020?
So it's been fascinating for me as a social scientist to working in this whole area of neuropolitics, which, to put it in a nutshell, is simply the science of the human brain on political information, looking at how we process politics and how politics influences the way we emotionally process information, including making decisions around elections. And so the science that I've been so privileged to get to do has really dug into the underlying brain processes that drive this just fascinating, confounding, and honestly somewhat disturbing emotional environment that we're in with our political discourse. For instance, I've had the opportunity to use this methodology to conduct a test with some industry partners on the last presidential debate. And using a measure called skin conductance, which is an unconscious measure of how intense an emotional response is, we were able to look at patterns of Trump supporters, Biden supporters, and undecided voters, and found some really interesting patterns in the emotional responses of Trump supporters compared to the other groups, in that they were a lot more intense in their emotional responses pretty much across the board. And what's really interesting about that finding is that lines up with some research that a colleague at Texas Tech, Eric Busey, and I did on the 2016 election that showed that Donald Trump really does perform very well at energizing this base emotionally and driving responses. And I think that's a phenomenon that has really been introduced into our political environment. And if we step back from that for a minute, I think it's important to look at how to deal with that positively and productively.
It's very interesting activating the emotional response. In fact, a little bit of data maybe to back that up, and I'll turn our attention to Mr. Foley as well. And sorry, we're getting close to our time, so I'll ask you to make this about 30 seconds. But we did see a survey that suggested about 70% of voters feel the country would be irreparably damaged if the other candidate won. Can you assess this sort of belief from a reality versus rhetoric point of view?
Yeah, I think political discourse generally, and certainly in the coverage of it in news media, certainly tends to reflect this sort of teamsmanship, sort of almost as you would expect from allegiances to sports teams in terms of how they want to sort of see the other side. And when you're engaged in that contest, it's really easy to come to really fatalistic conclusions about the nature of that particular outcome. And I think that, in some cases, that's not necessarily to say that there aren't outcomes that we should be concerned about. And even if our preferred candidate wins, there are certainly problems that we really want to focus on, and that I think that it's important that we turn our attention to what those issues are and exactly how we can sort of approach sort of resolving some of those issues. And one thing that I think a lot of this election sort of demonstrates is that politicians and people who are engaged in this process, and Trump in particular, is very, very good at playing to the newsworthiness tendencies of journalists, and that we know from research that coverage of the 2016 election tended to focus on that candidate much more and tended to cover him in ways that was more effective at sort of reaching, as Dr. Bowles mentions, that sort of emotional energizing base, and that there certainly needs to be a lot of calibration, certainly within the political parties about this. But I think it's just so important for people to be critically reflexive about the way that people are attempting to appeal to those things in the process of making decisions and how they eventually vote and participate in the electoral process.
It's fascinating stuff, Mr. Bowles, Mr. Foley. I could probably talk to you for an hour on this subject, but we do have parameters to hit here. We really appreciate your time and perspective here tonight.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much.
And just a few minutes left in our show. I want to bring back Mr. Ritter and Mr. Calabretta, sort of a look at it. But first, I know we've hardly talked about the presidential election, sort of the big story hanging over everybody's heads. But when we look at the data of concessions and calling races, the past 3 presidential elections have largely been decided by now. We've been warned as voters to be patient as mail-in votes and late counts have come in. What do we expect, I'll start with Mr. Ritter, over the next couple of days in the presidential race?
Well, I will note that because of the unprecedented levels of mail voting in this election, I think voters need to be prepared for election results that may not be finalized immediately. This is particularly the case because all states have some form of mail voting, but states vary in when election administrators are allowed to count mail ballots. In Washington state, that process can start before election day, but in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, which are critical swing states, mail vote counting can only start today. That being said, beyond election day waiting beyond election day for presidential election results, it's not entirely new to elections in the United States or election administration. In fact, not all ballots are counted on election day for any presidential election. And in fact, the final electoral college votes will not be cast in state capitals until December 14th. And so the waiting that goes behind the vote counting process is entirely normal. I think people should be prepared for that this election season.
And Mr. Calabretta, what are you telling all of these first-time voters, and I'll ask you to be about 30 seconds, just in terms of their eagerness to find out who won this presidential election? How are you preparing the people you work with over the next couple of days?
Well, I've already started right after the polls closed today. I'm essentially telling students not to doom scroll on Twitter because it's hard to discern which states, like Michael was just talking about, which states have already started counting those absentee ballots and which haven't started counting them yet, and how that's going to affect the results. So it's easy to look at these preliminary results and either feel a sense of dread or feel a sense of joy that your candidate's winning. So it's just it always takes a week or so before they're certified. So let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, very much, and thank you all for watching tonight.
You're watching Election Night coverage on Northwest Public Broadcasting, a community service of the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University.